Welcome to part 3. So the first thing we're going to do is take that purple wool bats that we chose at the beginning of the tutorial. I'm going to split it in half, just a section, so we've got two equal looking pieces here. I'm then going to measure it, so it's about 6 inches in length, which is what you want roughly, but don't worry if it's too long because we can trim away the excess. So we're making his braces, so we want them to be quite narrow, so I'm just going to take my multi-tool and start felting this down. I'm going to fold over one side and then just work along the length of it, felting it down and then just continually turning it. You don't want to press too hard with your needles here, because if you press too hard, what will happen is you'll end up with something really fluffy where it attaches itself to the brush mat. So try and keep your stabs quite light. Don't go too kind of hell for leather when you're felting this. And then you just want to fold over the opposite side, so you've got a very narrow piece. And because it's very fine, I'm just giving it a really good felt down to make sure that there's no areas where there could be any breakages where it could fall apart easily. So I'm just making sure that I'm felting down the length of it to create a nice secure piece of felt, almost like a piece of material. So I'm just turning it again, felting down that length until I've got a nice solid piece. So there's no opaqueness there at all. It's a nice solid purple piece that's nice and strong. But it takes a little while just to get rid of that fluffiness. But don't worry too much, because when we add it here, we can get rid of some of that fluffiness. So I'm just taking away some of the excess. I'm going to place it kind of in the middle at the bottom, sort of just before the middle, folding up the end to get rid of any looseness and get a nice flat edge. And then I'm just folding that looseness into the brace, and then I'm going to fold it over the back and cross it over and then felt it down onto the opposite side of his trouser. So when you're doing this, you do want to felt it a little bit into the torso, but don't felt it too much, because then it takes away from that separate look of the braces compared to the shirt itself. So just felt it a little bit, but you definitely want to felt it significantly more into the trouser area just to get it nice and secure so it's not going to come away. So I've just chopped off that excess there, and I'm just going to felt that loose piece up into the rest of the brace using my fine twisted needles again, and just taking my time there to get that nice and secure and get a nice straight edge as well, so there's no lumpiness or unevenness. So I'm going to do the same thing with the other brace, and then folding it over the back across the brace that we've already added. And eventually you should have something that looks like this. And I'm just using my needles just to make them a bit narrower by pushing them in slightly, pushing that felt wool into itself on the brace, just to create a nice narrow brace. And you just want to keep going until it's nice and secure, and it looks like that. So next I'm going to take some of that mustard merino wool bats that we chose earlier. I'm just going to roll it between my fingers. You can't really see on camera, unfortunately. And then I'm just going to place it at the bottom of the first brace. I felt that in using my single medium twisted cross star needle. Ooh, that's a mouthful for 7 o'clock in the morning. And I'm just felting it in a circular motion so that we get a nice circular shape, so it looks like a little button that's holding his braces in place. And I'm going to do the same on the other side with the opposite brace. And just use your needle to, if you've got any kind of naughty bits that are trying to make it not look circular, just push those in. But don't felt this too much, because we don't want it to go into the brace. We want it to, again, sort of stand proud a little bit so it looks like a button. So just be aware of that. Right, so he's looking great. So the next thing we need to do is work on his head. So I've already got here a ball that I've made, and inside is some white Shetland core wool, and then covering it is my orange wool bats. So I'm just going to take my fine needles again, not my medium needles, because I want to get a nice smooth finish here. And I'm just going to felt this down again. And then if I've got any areas like here where I've got some white coming through, I'll just take some little strips off and just cover that over so that we've got a nice solid orange shape. And it's really important to get that orange nice and solid, the colour, because when we come to add the facial features later on, some of the white could be exposed if we haven't got enough orange in place. So you want to look for a medium squidge. I'm just going to check that that looks in proportion with his body, which it does. And what I'm going to do first is create a little divot in the top of his head, And this is going to be where the kind of the top of the pumpkin would sit when you carve out that top of the pumpkin and then you place it back on top again. That's what we're creating here. So you don't need to go too deeply with this, but you want it to be relatively wide. I'd say probably about 2.5 to 3 centimetres in diameter. But what you don't want is it to be massively wide. You want to keep it natural, like a pumpkin would look. So if you want to make a really wide one, that's fine if you're going for something different. But I want to try and keep it looking kind of as pumpkin-like as possible, really. Depth-wise, I've gone in about 0.5 centimetre, I'd say. And I'm just trying to work on getting a nice circular shape. And I've swapped over to my medium needles there to do that, just to give myself a bit more felting power. And I'm not too worried about leaving any indentations here because we're going to have it covered over later anyway. So don't worry too much if you've got any little holes where you've been felting, because they're going to be covered over by the top of the pumpkin towards the end of the tutorial. It's very exciting that it's the last part. This is where everything comes together. You're going to start seeing everything really sort of come together in beautiful synchronicity. So I'm just giving his felt a bit of face, a bit of a felt. And then I'm going to use my fingers and I'm going to press down and create 2 indentations. And this is going to be where his eyes are going to sit. And I'm using my fingers on a bit of an angle here to create a slightly kind of oval shape for his eye. So I'm just pressing down and then again using my needles to felt down what I've just pressed down. And you want to get this relatively deep now because we want to create the appearance that there's holes in his head. So try and get them as deep as you can. And this is why it's important to have that squidge to the pumpkin head as well, because if it was too solid, we'd really struggle to get these holes, these indentations for the eyes, the nose and the mouth in place and get them deep enough to give them a really authentic look. So that's why it's really important to just sort of stop when you get to about a medium amount of firmness with your ball. So I'm just speeding things up now and just getting that really felted in, still using my fingers, and I want to get a relatively large eye. And now that I've got my eyes in place, I'm going to create a triangle shape for my nose. So I'm using my needles with my fine twisted needles, one over the other. And I'm just creating that point of the triangle, so the point's at the top. And then creating that slightly flatter side underneath to create that triangular shape. I want quite a long triangle here. That's what I'm aiming for, but you can go with whatever size triangle you want. You don't have to do what I'm doing. And likewise with the eyes as well. I mean, you can make a really scary pumpkin face. You don't have to go with a cute one. You can do whatever you feel like doing. And you could go really complicated. You could go for something that's kind of been carved in a really crazy, kind of spooky way. So it's really up to you. So I'm just going to start felting that in a bit deeper, just to get that indentation in for when we add the black in a minute. Okay, so I've got my black wool bats here and I've got his eyes and his nose that have been felted down. So I'm going to take my pieces of wool bats, I'm just going to place those in his eye sockets. I'm just going to get rid of some of that excess. There's a bit too much there. I don't want too much because then it takes away from the depth if I'm packing too much in. So that's about right. And then I'm going to take my needles and felt that down. So again, just work with the shape that you've already created in the eye. And I'm creating this sort of oval shape, so it's going sort of narrower towards the inner upper side of the eye, and then slightly wider as it's going down, as you can see on the video. And then same on the other side. Just turn them over for ease. But just check for symmetry, okay? It doesn't matter if it's not quite symmetrical, but I think it's quite nice to have an element of symmetry here. And then I'm just going to do the same with his nose. So I'm just going to place a little bit in his nose area and then get that felted in as well. I'm just going to use my fine needle initially just to help me with getting that shape of the triangle with the black. And what I'll do when I'm felting anything, I'll swap round my single needles and my double needles depending on what I'm doing, just to give myself a bit more flexibility with the felt. And there's certain areas that are easier with a single needle, and then certain areas that are easier with a double needle. So I don't kind of like sort of rigidly stick to using one needle throughout. So I'm putting his eyebrows in next, and I'm going for my upside down rainbow. It's my favourite eyebrow to use to get that nice cutesy look that I like to create in a lot of my sculptures. I don't want to create a scary pumpkin here. I want to create a nice friendly pumpkin. So I've tacked it in place with my single needle, and then I'm using my double needles just to get a bit more depth there and more of a solid line, so we don't have any of those sort of lumps and bumps that you would get with felting it in a little bit. So I want to get a nice firm line in there. Okay, and I'm just going to felt around his face a bit more. So the next thing we're going to do is add his smile. So I'm going to tack it in with my double needles, using them side by side to create a nice wide smile. I want him to have like this real rictus wide smile. So I'm going all the way up to the cheeks here, like a pumpkin. You know, you see some pumpkins with these really super wide smiles. That's what I want to go for. And then I'm going to take my black wool bats and I'm going to roll it between my fingers. Get rid of that naughty white bit there. A very narrow piece to create this kind of like rope-like feel to it. I'm going to place it on my pumpkin, and I'm just going to initially just tack it down. And just make sure that you get rid of any kind of naughty bits of other fibre that might be in there, so you've got a solid black line. Because if you get any white or anything like that in any of the black that we're adding to the pumpkin head, it just takes away from the realism that we're going for. So what I'm doing here is I'm using my single needle just to start adding and pushing the wool upwards to start adding some triangular shape. I've swapped my double needle because it's easier. Triangular shape on his mouth, so we get those that kind of cut out jaggedy smile that that we kind of identify with pumpkins. So I'm just pushing the wool upwards with my needles. This bit can be a bit tricky, so be patient with it, take your time. I wanted to go for something whereby the triangles were quite close together, but you could go for wider triangles if you wanted to, and this would actually be easier as well. So it's really entirely again up to you as to how you do your smile. So once I've got that roughly in place with my my double needles, I'm going to then just get a bit more shape with my single needles by pushing that black wool, certain points of it, into the orange to create those points. And just be cautious of your hands here, because I'm kind of working across sideways. If you slip, you don't want to stab your hand, so just be really careful. Okay, so he is looking good. He's starting to look super spooky. So the next thing to do is add his pumpkin lines in, because obviously he's not going to look too much like a pumpkin if we don't add those in. So I'm using my fine twisted needles again just to felt some lines across his face. And I'm just going to tack them in initially, not going too deeply, just to make sure that I'm happy with the positioning of them. It's not too, you don't have to be too even with this, because pumpkins don't tend to have even segments on themselves. So on themselves, I don't know, it's very early in the morning, I'm not making much sense, but you can see what I'm doing on the video. So basically you want to create these segments, but don't worry if there's some that are wider and some that are narrower. I think that just adds to the kind of the realism really of the pumpkin that we're trying to create. So I'm tacking them down initially, and then once I've tacked them down, I'm going to go in with my medium twisted cross star single needle and just felt them in a bit more deeply, just to get a bit more shaping there, make him look more pumpkin-like. But just make sure that they all meet with the bottom of the pumpkin. And I should say that at the bottom of the pumpkin I have added, I forgot to show you, apologies, but it's the same pretty much as we did with the top. I've added a hole at the bottom in the centre, and that's where his head is going to sit on the neck. So you want to make sure that it meets that hole. So next I've got a brown pastel chalk, and I've scraped them off with a knife, and I've got a very fine brush here. You want quite a dark brown, okay? You don't want to go for anything that's a light brown because it won't work, this next part. And what I'm going to do is, along the edge of the eye, I'm just going to lightly paint with the powder around the edges of the eye. And all this does is it softens that hard black that we've already added, but it gives that appearance of depth. It's a really cool trick. So it just makes him look more real and more like he's had a section of his eye chopped out, and it just softens everything and makes him look a lot more spooky as well, I think. So it's quite a cool little thing to do, especially if you're making anything like this. But I mean, I love using pastel chalks in my felting anyway. I think it really adds another dynamic, another level to the sculpture. So don't add too much, and make sure you tap off the excess, because what you don't want is to have an area where you've got a bit of solid colour and then an area where you don't, because then it'll ruin the piece. So you just want to make sure that you do this very gradually. So I'm just going to move on to the other eye now, and then I'm going to do his nose as well. So just again adding a little bit in, and I'll also add some to his mouth. And then later, I'm also going to add some to the top of where his segments are kind of divoted into his head. So just around the top area. No, not the whole face, because it will look too much, but just a little bit, just to add a bit of shading again and give him more character. So just take your time with this, but it's really effective once it's completed. And I think he just looks... It just makes them look super realistic. And just go cautious with the mouth, because that can be a bit trickier with the mouth because you've got all those angles there. So just take your time with it. I keep saying take your time. Basically, take your time. All right, I'm just going to check to make sure that he's looking good. He's looking all in proportion and he looks really cool. So the next thing I want to do is I want to attach his head. So I've got my polyamide thread here, and I'm going to thread it through my dull needle, my medium dull needle. And you want a reasonable amount coming through the other side so that the thread's not gonna come out. I'm gonna go through his neck, and this is why it's important that we have a nice solid neck. So I'm gonna take it at the bottom of his neck, up through the top of his neck. I've gone on a bit of an angle here, and I'm going through the hole that I've made at the bottom of his head, and then up through the top where the segment is. And I'm just gonna feed that through. And I'm going to leave a length coming out of his neck here, okay? I'm not going to pull it all the way through. So I'm going to leave probably about 8 inches of the polyamide thread coming out of his head. Then I'm going to take my needle and go back through all the way. And you can see that hole I've made at the bottom there, which is about 1 centimetre in depth, and is the circumference of his neck. So we want his neck to sit nicely and snugly in there. Pull that through, and then we're going to go back through the top of his neck, through to the bottom of his neck. And I went for 3 of these just to really get him nice and secure. You could do more if you want, you could do less if you want. I think you definitely need a minimum of 2. I wouldn't do any more than a minimum of 2, but I just wanted him to have that security there so that I know his head's not going to come off for any reason, but also it gives me a little bit more flexibility when it comes to manipulating the head once he's finished as well. I quite like the fact that he can turn his head and you can put it on the side and everything else. So going back up through the top again. Sorry, I've gone for 4, not 3. So that's my third. So it can get a bit tricky when you get all tangled, but just be patient. And then I'm going to go down for 1 more for the 4th. All the way through the head and then back through the neck. Try not to go through the body when you're doing this, because then you're going to have polyamide thread showing in your sculpture. Whereas if you do it through the neck, we can hide it nicely so no one can see. So it's just getting the right position as you thread it through, as you can see here, to make sure it's just going through that neck area, but it's going through enough of the neck area so that it's going to be nice and secure. So I'm just going to move that out the way. And then I should have 2 lengths of polyamide thread coming out of the bottom of his neck now. as you can see here. So I'm pulling them both tight to pull his head onto his neck. Just going to turn his head into the position I want it, and then I'm going to tie a really strong knot with those 2 pieces of polyamide thread. Okay, and that will secure his head nicely into place. So that's my first. I think I've just done a double knot here. I haven't done anything major, but the polyamide thread's so strong, and it tends to, when you tie a knot in it, it tends to stay really well. So I've gone for 3. Security in 3, guys. And then I'm just going to trim away that excess. I don't want to go for too big a knot because then it shows up on the sculpture. So you want something that could be easily hidden. So just trimming away those excess pieces. And there you go. His head is in place. And look, it can be moved around. It's so cool. He's looking great. So the next thing I want to do is make his scarf. So I'm just going to felt this down in the same way that we did our braces earlier on. So nothing new that we're doing here. I'm just doing it on a longer scale, and it's slightly wider. It's probably about sort of 1 centimetre to 1.5 centimetres in its thickness. And then I'm just going to felt it down until I get a nice smooth finish. And then I've trimmed away the edges, and then I've folded them on top and felted them down. So I've sealed those edges that we've cut. And I'm just going to tie that around his neck like so. And you can position this however you want to position it. So I've sort of done it so I've got a slightly longer piece. And then we're going to add his shoes or his boots. So I've got a small strip, and I'm going to felt this along the foot that we've bent up. Okay, and we're wrapping this, but this can be quite tricky because you're working with quite a narrow area. So I'm just felting this down with my fine twisted needles. And then I'm just going to turn this round. We're going to go past the end of the foot, okay, by about 0.5 centimetre, and then felt back round again. And then we don't want to go up too high, probably just as the ankle starts. And I'm just going to felt that down into position. And you just want to make sure that you felt that toe inwards as well. Go careful because you're going to be hitting the wire, but it's important to do that so you get a nice rounded toe area so it looks more shoe-like. And you really need to make sure that you incorporate the heel as well into that wrap. So I'm just going to felt it down. Try not to add too much because it will start to look quite unnatural. So I've done the same thing on the opposite side. So I've got 2 kind of booty type things added to his feet now, but we want to make them look more realistic. So I'm going to go back to my brush mat, and we're going to create 2 more segments, 2 more strips, okay? And these are going to create the tops of the boots. So I've got 2 roughly equal pieces here. Just pull those apart. And then I'm just going to take my multi-tool again and felt those down. So I'm felting one side this time, and I'm leaving the other side loose because that's the side we're going to attach to our boot. So same on the other side. So you've got a piece that's probably about 1.5 centimetres in thickness. And then once you've got those 2 pieces made, we're going to go back to our pumpkin. I'm just going to trim that end off there. So we've got a nice straight edge, nothing too long. And I'm just going to place that so that it's sitting along his ankle, and you've got this kind of area at the top where the flat piece sits, which is creating a bit of a gap, so it looks like an actual boot. And I'm just going to use my needles then to felt that down into place. If you've got too much, don't be afraid to trim some away. Okay, don't feel like you have to use all of the piece. Just turn him round. Felt that down as well. And just get it really nicely integrated with the purple you've already added. So take your time to felt it down, and because we're using fine needles, you get a much easier felt. You couldn't do this using your medium needles because it's too densely compacted, the wool and the foot area here. So use your fine needles, but just be cautious because it is quite a firm, solid area, and you've got that wire there that you don't, just going to trim that away, that you don't break your needles. I'm just going to go in and felt that down and felt that back bit in. I'm not too worried about the back piece being attached to the leg because it's going to be hidden by his trouser. But But I do want to just kind of go in with my needles just to create a bit more depth. So I'm just going to go inwards here, just to push that down a bit between the brown and the purple. So again, we've got that division there. And I'm just going to go around and felt that all down. Okay, so then you should have two boots once you've done the other side that look like this. I'm just going to take some of my jute string, I'm going to snip some away and tie that around his ankles just to give him more of that scarecrow look to his boots. And you don't have to do this if you don't want to. I've just chosen to do this because I just thought it's quite nice to make a bit of a thing of the top of the boot, looking boot-like, I guess. So the next thing to do now is make the top of his head. Okay, so I'm going to take some of my orange wool bats. I'm going to create a kind of almost ball-like shape but flat. So I'm kind of wrapping it in a triangular way. And I'm just going to hold it down on my felting mat, felt that down initially to secure it into place. And then I'm just going to use my fine needles to create a circular shape, okay? So just using my needles to push those corners in to get rid of that triangular look. But you want something that kind of is quite a bit higher at the top and then narrows towards the bottom edges, like you would do with the top of a pumpkin. So I'm just going to go around with my needles and do that. And just check it against the head as well to make sure it's sitting with the head and it's not bigger or smaller or anything like that. You want it to sit snugly inside. So just double check it as you go along to make sure it's the right size. Just giving it a squeeze as well. And again, you want a bit of a squidge to this because we're going to add some more segment lines to it in a moment. So don't go too solid. And then I'm just going to take my needles again and create those segments. And don't worry about them matching the top of the head, because you know you'd cut out the top of a pumpkin. Can't talk. You chop out the top out. You chop out the top of a pumpkin, and then you place the head or the top of the pumpkin back on again in a different position sometimes, wouldn't you? To how you've cut it out, or something. Well, you may do, you may not. So I'm not too worried about it matching up with the lines that we've already created in his main head. So I'm just going to speed this up for you, but you've already done this, so you know what you're doing here. Just keep going until you've got those lines nice and deeply in place. Just again, keep lifting it and turning it so it doesn't adhere to the mat as well. And then I'm just going to take some more of my pastel brown chalk and my fine brush, and I'm just going to place in some brown along those lines that I've added, just to give a bit more depth to the pumpkin. So again, just tap away any excess. So you have something that looks like this. Then we're going to make his stalk. So I'm going to take some more of my brown wool bats, and I'm just going to roll it into a tube, a fine tube, and then we're just going to felt that down. So we've got a relatively thick tube that's got sort of a narrower top and then a thicker bottom for his stalk. And just be cautious of your fingers here because you're working with something very tiny, so it'd be very easy to stab yourself in the finger. So then I'm just going to trim away the excess. I'm going to just sit that on the pumpkin, the top of the pumpkin, and I'm going to glue that in place. And I want to glue it in place because I think if I felt it down, I'm going to take away that shape with the segments that we've already created, which would be a real shame. So I think it's really important that we just use super glue in this case, and it's also a lot easier as well, and you're still getting the same effect. So super glue is much easier for attaching the stalk. So I've got some of my green olive wool here, and I'm creating this kind of, again, rope-like feel to it. And I'm just using my fingers to twist it and then using my fine needles to felt it down after I've twisted it. So I want to get a nice secure piece. I'm going to grab some of my wax and I'm going to rub my wax all over this piece. So I'm covering all of it. And then I'm going to take a cocktail stick and I'm going to roll this round my cocktail stick. And I'm going to hold it down whilst it's rolled on the cocktail stick. And I'm just going to give it a bit of a light stab down the sides so that when I remove it, you've got this little curly piece of wool that I've made. So it's almost like it's had a bit of a perm. And I'm just going to felt that down into the bottom of the brown stalk to look like his little root that's coming out. So I'm just going to hold that down and I'm just going to use my single needle to do that. You don't want to use a double needle there because you'll ruin all the work you've already done. So go with a single needle. Okay, that's looking good. Just give there a bit more of a stab just to make sure it's nice and secure. There we are. And then the last thing to do is I'm just going to glue this, super glue this onto the top of the divot that we made at the very beginning of this part of the tutorial. So just a bit of super glue dotted on the top, don't need loads, just a small amount because it's really strong stuff. And I'm just going to place that onto the top of his head, like so. Cool. And there you go, he's finished. So that is your pumpkin scarecrow completed, and he is all ready for Halloween to scare people, although I think he's going to struggle with that because he does look incredibly cute. But we've incorporated all kinds of things in this tutorial. We've incorporated the Fimo, we've made loads of clothing, we've also incorporated some of the pastel chalk as well. So we've incorporated a lot of elements into our needle felted sculpture. So please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel. I'm posting every Friday, Saturday and Sunday. And I will see you next week with another tutorial. Have a spooktacular Halloween. Bye!